Bun găsit la emisiunea Știință și Cunoaștere. Continuăm seria de interviuri foarte îngrijorătoare cu profesorul de medicină și psihiatrie clinică, dr. Paul Rosch, președinte și membru de onoare a peste 50 de institute academice din lume, a cărui biografie a fost prezentată în emisiunile anterioare, ce trebuie neapărat să le revedeți. În acest episod vom dezvălui de ce colesterolul și grăsimile saturate nu cauzează boli de inimă, în timp ce adevăratele cauze ale bolilor de inimă nu ne-au fost prezentate cu suficientă claritate. Veți afla de ce corporațiile farmaceutice și producătorii de alimente au înșelat consumatorii și ce puteți face mai departe. Dear Professor Rosch, welcome to our Science and Knowledge TV program in Romania on TVR Cluj for a new series of interviews, and it is an honor and an amazing opportunity to speak with you, and I appreciate the courage you have in order to step forward and speak about the most important issues of our modern times.
Glad to be here.
You concluded our last dialogue by promising to discuss in a future interview how low-fat food companies deceive the public with false claims and how big pharma hypes the benefits and minimizes or ignores the adverse side effects of statins by manipulating data in company-sponsored studies. In addition, you promised to discuss what really causes heart disease and advise us to stay tuned. Let's address the fallacious low-fat food and statins claims first.
We have previously discussed how the cholesterol hypothesis was based on niche-cause studies that were done on rabbits. Rabbits are herbivorous, so cholesterol and fat produce an inflammatory response. When fed to rats and other meat-eating animals, no such lesions could be produced. And these deposits did not occur in the coronary arteries, but rather the aorta and large vessels where pressure was higher. They also differed under the microscope from atherosclerotic plaque in humans. The high-fat diet causes elevated cholesterol, causes coronary heart disease sequence, got its biggest boost from Ansel Keys' 7-country study, which was severely criticized because of its faulty methodology that excluded 7 countries in which a high-fat diet was associated with a decrease in coronary heart disease. In the Prudent Diet study, in which saturated fat was strictly avoided, there were 8 deaths from heart disease after 10 years, compared to none in controls who ate meat 3 times a day. Similarly, the huge Monica study followed more than 7 million men and women aged 25 to 64 in 21 countries for over 10 years, found no correlation between death rates and fat consumptions. It was actually just the opposite, since the 8 countries with the lowest cardiac death rates had the highest saturated fat intake, and the 8 with the highest death rates has the lowest fat intake.
Please tell us what were the conclusions of the Framingham study and what had been published on the dietary guidelines for Americans.
The Framingham study, which began around 1950, established cholesterol as well as smoking and hypertension as risk factors for coronary disease. But it also failed to demonstrate that a high fat intake caused an elevated cholesterol. In a 1979 editorial, the director, William Castelli, wrote, in Framingham, the more saturated fat one ate, the more cholesterol one ate, the more calories one ate, the lower the person's serum cholesterol, and the less they weighed. And we also reviewed the origin of the 1980 dietary guidelines for Americans, which recommended reducing saturated fat to less than 10% of total calories, and showed that it was strongly influenced by low-fat food manufacturers and had absolutely no scientific basis. These guidelines are revised every 5 years, but despite mounting evidence of the dangers of restricting fat, few changes have been made since then. This has resulted in a high carbohydrate diet and a plethora of low-fat foods and the current epidemics of obesity and type 2 diabetes.
Yes, but statin manufacturers claim that statins are useful in many other diseases. Can you tell us in more details?
There are so many false claims by statin manufacturers we could devote an entire interview to this. It's claimed that statins allegedly prevent or can benefit multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, prostate, breast, and colon cancer, osteoporosis, peripheral artery disease, stroke, congestive failure, atrial fibrillation, chronic obstructive disease, and high-risk patients with diabetes and kidney disease. None of these alleged benefits have anything to do with lowering cholesterol or LDL. What is likely is that most of these patients were receiving statins because of an elevated cholesterol that had protected them from these disorders for decades. Several studies show that high cholesterol protects against infections and cancer. Support for this comes from the observation that patients who inherit a very high cholesterol due to familial hypercholesterolemia are much less likely to develop infections or malignancies and usually don't die from heart disease. A fairly recent paper that I contributed to with other members of THINKS, the International Network of Cholesterol Skeptics, reviewed 19 studies in which LDL was measured in more than 68,000 people who were followed for several years. We found that those with the highest LDL levels lived the longest, and one study reported that those with high HDL cholesterol lived longer than those taking statins.
Please tell us about your recent paper where you and other top scientists had published proof about LDL.
In another paper we just published, we reviewed all the pertinent literature and provided additional proof that LDL does not cause coronary heart disease. However, it's difficult to get anything published that disputes the benefits of statins due to the cholesterol cartel, an extremely powerful and wealthy coalition of pharmaceutical companies that provide statins and other drugs to lower cholesterol or reduce fat absorption, manufacturers of low-fat foods or substitutes like soy and margarine that are actually harmful, makers of non-prescription supplements, phytosterols to lower cholesterol, chitosan to bind fats and so-called fat burners, and manufacturers of testing equipment to measure cholesterol, LDL, and other blood lipids. Cholesterol cartel has a tremendous influence, if not control, over regulatory agencies like the FDA and Congress, medical schools through research grants and CME credits, the media, peer-reviewed journals, print, and especially direct-to-consumer TV ads. Organizations like AMA, AHA, and ACC are influenced, as are doctors, with drug rep, illegal kickbacks, paid vacations, and other perks.
Please tell us how exactly we were deceived by the cholesterol cartel drugs.
The cholesterol cartel deceives us by exaggerating benefits and minimizing or ignoring adverse side effects, not releasing raw data from company-sponsored trials so that conclusions can be validated by unbiased investigators, statistical manipulations that emphasize relative rather than absolute risk, and doctoring data in other ways. The failure to cite numerous contrary publications by independent researchers in review articles and meta-analyses. Failure to fully disclose an author's conflicts of interest, and ignoring FDA regulations for banning those with conflicts of interest from serving on advisory boards for approving drugs. They also provide lavish funds to respected organizations and eminent authorities in return for their support and approval. They have false advertising claims for low-fat foods and beverages, as well as statins, and they persecute anyone who opposes the cholesterol cartel's views.
And about that, about persecution, please tell us some examples about scientists who were persecuted.
Some examples of persecution include George Mann, professor of medicine at Vanderbilt, a renowned nutritionist whose Framingham research finding no evidence that fat intake was related to heart attacks or mortality was never published. In a 1977 New England Journal of Medicine review entitled Diet, Heart, and the Venera, he wrote that, quote, "The dietary dogma was a moneymaker for segments of the food industry, a fundraiser for the Heart Association, and busy work for thousands of fat chemists," end quote. And that, quote, to be a center was to be unfunded because the peer review system rewards conformity and excludes criticism, end quote. He cited the lack of relationship between diet and cholesterol, the disappointing cholesterol-lowering trials. And in 1991, he wanted to bring the issue before the public by organizing a conference in Washington, D.C. In his invitation to prominent speakers, he wrote, "Hundreds of millions of tax dollars are wasted by the bureaucracy and the self-interested Heart Association. Segments of the food industry play the game for profits. Research on the true causes and prevention is stifled by denying funding to the unbelievers. This meeting will review the data and expose the rascal." When the cholesterol cartel found out, they sent false notices to everyone that the event had been canceled. Participants backed out when they learned their funding would be cut off if they attended, and the foundation that offered to back it reneged. Mann eventually had to finance it himself.
But this is totally outrageous, and obviously in Romania nobody dares to speak publicly about this. I also had read on the internet about another researcher who had been persecuted, and his name is Uffe Ravenskov. I tried to contact him, but his website had a virus which stopped any messages from readers to be delivered. Otherwise, I can't explain why my messages had never received. Please tell us what happened with Uffe Ravenskov.
Uffe Ravenskov received his MD from the University of Copenhagen in 1961 and a PhD in chemistry and nephrology in 1973 from the University of Lund, where he served as professor of nephrology before leaving to devote his time to private investigations. These culminated in the 1997 publication of The Cholesterol Myths, exposing the fallacy that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. This provided a comprehensive and objective analysis of the literature dealing with the role of dietary fat and elevated blood cholesterol on health and coronary heart disease. It was painstakingly referenced with numerous citations proving that a high-fat diet did not cause either elevated cholesterol or coronary disease. In addition, it shows that high cholesterol actually confers protective benefits, especially in the elderly.
And what happened after Uffe Ravenscow published his conclusions in the book you had just mentioned?
Ravenscow's conclusions were so contrary to the prevailing dogma that he was severely berated by the bureaucracy, and his book was actually burned on a Finnish TV program by cholesterol proponents. He was also severely defamed on a Dutch TV programs, but critics refused to debate him on TV or anywhere else. They could only resort to such personal attacks because they were unable to refute any of his claims or conclusions.
But this is really outrageous, totally outrageous, and this is why I insisted in recording this new series of interviews. Please tell us the incidents related to Professor Kilmer McCauley and what happened in his case.
Kilmer McCauley, Harvard professor who suggested that homocysteine might be more than cholesterol and could be corrected with inexpensive B vitamins. Funding for research disappeared, leading to the loss of his laboratory at Massachusetts General Hospital. The hospital director told him to leave and, quote, never to come back, end quote. And his Harvard affiliation and tenure were also terminated in 1978. Although obviously well qualified for many positions that were being offered, and despite the fact that he did well on numerous occasions, he was unable to find employment for 2 years. When he and others who had recommended him made appropriate follow-up inquiries, they ran into a stone wall of silence. However, repeated rumors of poison phone calls from Harvard began to surface, and it was only after a leading Boston attorney threatened a lawsuit that things suddenly changed, and he was able to resume his research at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Providence. Since then, the contributions of homocysteine to heart attack, stroke, accelerated atherosclerosis has been repeatedly confirmed, as well as links to other disorders, including periodontal disease and cirrhosis of the liver. Kilmer has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors, and many feel he should be considered for a Nobel Prize. Harvard has welcomed him back with open arms, and even his former critics now acknowledge he was correct.
These are all very sad and frightening stories, but I am confident that these three scientists and many others like them will continue to speak the truth about statins and cholesterol. However, I have seen on many TV programs a lot of false advertising, maybe not so much in Romania as it is in US. Can you give us an example from your country?
With respect to false advertising, Dr. Robert Jarvik is a prime example. He introduces himself as doctor, attests to the years he has spent studying the heart and developing the Jarvik artificial heart. He praises the value of Lipitor, which he takes himself and recommends to others, and has shown jogging and apparently rowing a racing scull in a highly skilled fashion. The facts are that Dr. Jarvik is not a cardiologist, is not even licensed to practice medicine, has never treated a patient, and did not take Lipitor until he was hired for the ad for $1.5 million. He does not know how to skull, and the artificial heart that bears his name was invented by someone else and never worked. And the photos demonstrating his sculling expertise were of an athletic, late, middle-aged, accomplished rower who resembled him. Viewers were impressed with his stunt double's ability to turn the bad blades perfectly to achieve minimum drag between strokes. The close-up frames that actually showed Dr. Jarvik were taken while he was in a rowing apparatus on a platform to conceal that it was on dry land with the lake in the background. Few paid any attention to the asterisk after the claim that Lipitor resulted in a 36% reduction in heart attacks. It pointed to a statement in mice type at the bottom of the screen explaining there were 2 heart attacks out of 100 patients on Lipitor compared to 3 heart attacks for controls taking a placebo. However, this 1% difference was only for those with multiple risk factors for heart disease who took Lipitor daily for over a decade. How many people would take Lipitor if they knew that the likelihood of preventing a heart attack was 1 in 100 if they took it for over 10 years? And this is only for those at high risk. The difference, according to the study, is that for every 100 people who take Lipitor, only 1 additional person will be spared a heart attack compared to those who do nothing, and it is not known if that person would be you.
Unbelievable. This is just totally outrageous. Faking even the advertising, using stunt double, not to mention the statin drugs and their real effects. And I was taking statins almost 10 years because I lacked the knowledge, and at that time, as many others, I was not interested in science. Please tell us more about association versus causation.
Association does not prove causation. And note that all these ads deal with significantly reducing the risk of heart disease and heart attack without any proof that they did this. The early ad for Lipitor above the swimmer was required to state that Lipitor has not been shown to prevent heart disease or heart attacks. That mandate has now been removed. And it's important to reemphasize, although it says Lipitor reduces the risk of heart attacks by 36%, the actual absolute risk difference is only 1%. TV and other drug advertisements to consumers were initiated in the U.S. in 1997 for educational purposes, but quickly degenerated to serve as promotions for pharmaceuticals. These direct-to-consumer advertisements are banned in all other countries, save New Zealand, where efforts are still underway to eliminate or strictly limit them.
Please make an abstract of this in-depth presentation for our viewers in order to emphasize the main ideas.
We can summarize what has been demonstrated in previous interviews as follows. Increased dietary fat does not significantly elevate blood cholesterol or LDL. Elevated serum cholesterol, LDL, and other lipids are not the cause of either heart attacks or coronary atherosclerosis. Any cardioprotective or alleged benefits of statins are not related to lowering cholesterol or LDL. Inflammation may contribute to the development of atherosclerotic plaque, but is not its cause, since it is a response to injury. Any benefits of statins are more likely due to their anti-inflammatory and anti-thrombotic effects rather than lowering LDL or cholesterol. Statin therapy guidelines that mandate lowering LDL to an arbitrary level that is often difficult to achieve are dangerous, since they will lead to taking progressively larger doses of statins for longer periods of time, which will only increase the frequency and severity of heart attacks.
Please tell us about the association between cholesterol and atherosclerosis and heart attacks.
No association between cholesterol levels and the severity or extent of atherosclerosis has ever been found in autopsy studies of the general population. No clinical or imaging study has ever found any relation between the degree of cholesterol and a decrease in atherosclerosis. In one angiography study in which blood cholesterol had been reduced by more than 25% in patients, cholesterol was increased in 18 and unchanged in the other 8. A Mayo Clinic study similarly found that in all patients whose cholesterol had decreased by more than 60 milligrams, there was a significant increase in coronary atherosclerosis. Many risk factors are not causes of heart disease and are really risk markers that merely have some statistical association with heart attacks. There are several hundred risk factors for heart attacks, including premature vertex baldness, a deep earlobe crease, and a pot belly. However, a hair transplant, plastic surgery, or liposuction to remove these will not reduce the likelihood of a heart attack, since these are risk markers and association does not mean causation. The Mr. Fit multiple risk factor intervention trial significantly reduced or eliminated the 3 Framingham risk factors of cholesterol, hypertension, and smoking, but showed no reduction in heart disease deaths. The intervention group actually had higher mortality rates from cancer, accidents, and violence. Relative risk is not as important as absolute risk, or NNT, the number needed to treat.
Let us now focus on what causes heart attacks. Why does injury to the endothelium of the coronary artery result in atherosclerosis? Does increased cholesterol cause atherosclerosis? And what is the role of inflammation?
When Virchow first discovered that atheroma deposits were rich in cholesterol in 1856, he thought that cholesterol in the blood somehow infiltrated the arterial wall and irritated the endothelial lining. That's how the cholesterol hypothesis originated. The term atherosclerosis did not exist since it was introduced by Felix Marchand in 1904. And Virchow described atherosclerosis as endoarteritis chronica deformans nodosa. The suffix itis emphasized it resulted from an inflammatory process that had injured the inner lining of the artery. The cholesterol deposits came later. But cholesterol is a large inert molecule. It was hard to explain how it could cause inflammation of the inner lining of the arteries. As you recall, Virchow specifically avoided stating that the deposits were due to inflammation, since inflammation had been defined by the Roman physician Celsus in the 1st century as calor, tumor, rubor, and dolor, heat, swelling, redness, and pain. These were signs and symptoms that could be seen or felt, whereas this was a silent process that could only be seen under the microscope as an area of cloudiness and swelling. Inflammation is a response to injury, does not cause atherosclerosis or heart disease, as statin manufacturers now claim as a result of the flawed Jupiter study. If inflammation was the culprit, then why was the powerful anti-inflammatory drug Vioxx withdrawn? Because it caused heart attacks and strokes. We need to find a new term to describe this silent prophagistic process to avoid confusion.
Please, let's go back a little more to the history of cholesterol. In our first series, you had briefly presented the research done by Russian scientists, but I'd like to know more details and mostly what happened after Alexander Ignatovsky and Ilya Mechnikov published their results.
There was little clinical interest in cholesterol until 50 years later, when there were some mysterious deaths in a Russian battalion during the 1904 war between Russia and Japan. The problem was investigated by Alexander Ignatowski, professor of internal medicine at the Imperial Military Academy in St. Petersburg, who determined it was due to polluted meat. He fed some tainted meat to rabbits, and although none died, autopsies revealed an increase in fatty deposits in large arteries. This was consistent with the theory of Ilya Mechnikov, a Nobel Prize recipient who had previously proposed that an excess of dietary protein accelerated hardening of the arteries and other stigmata of aging. Ignatowski fed rabbits a diet of meat, milk, and dairy products that caused similar lesions, which seemed to confirm Mechnikov's protein toxicity theory, and published his results in 1909. In 1910, Adolf Windaus, who was later also awarded a Nobel Prize, showed that such lesions had 20 times more cholesterol than a normal arterial wall.
Yes, but how did they reach the conclusion that cholesterol was the culprit in all cases?
These two publications made a great impression on Nikolai Anichkov, who had just graduated from the same Imperial Military Medical Academy in St. Petersburg. He decided to develop an animal model of atherosclerosis, also in rabbits. After several experiments, he showed that simply feeding purified cholesterol obtained from egg yolks in sunflower oil could produce the identical changes Ignatowski had described with his high-protein diet. This established cholesterol as the culprit. In his 1913 paper, Anichkov reported that the earliest lesions appeared in the aortic arch and had vacuolated cells containing cholesterol.
Yes, but what was the first evidence that diet high in saturated fat and cholesterol caused coronary heart disease in humans?
The first clue that a diet high in saturated fat and cholesterol could cause coronary disease in humans was in 1916, when Cornelius de Langen, a Dutch physician working in Java, published a paper in an obscure journal reporting that native Indonesians had much lower rates of heart disease compared to Dutch colonists. They also had lower cholesterol levels, which he attributed to their primarily vegetarian diet, in contrast to the large amounts of meat and dairy products consumed by the Dutch. More importantly, serum cholesterol and coronary heart disease increased in Javanese stewards on Dutch ships, as well as Javanese who began to eat like the Dutch. While that seemed to confirm the high saturated fat diet and elevated cholesterol coronary heart disease sequence of events, association does not prove causation. And few physicians or researchers knew or were interested in any of the above studies, since coronary heart disease was not a major problem, because most people didn't live long enough to have symptoms, much less die from it.
So, all this happened 100 years ago, but the main issue of what is causing atherosclerosis and heart attacks remained unsolved. What happened next?
Carl von Rokitansky, an eminent Australian pathologist and contemporary of Virchow, reserved Virchow's causal role of inflammation because he believed that atherosclerotic plaque was composed of multiple layers of thrombi or clots, since they had the same components, especially fibrin. His atherothrombotic theory is likely correct, since almost all causes of coronary heart disease, including stress, involve increased clotting tendencies. And those that decrease coronary heart disease, like exercise and alcohol, decrease clotting and platelet clumping.
But in our modern 21st century, we now have an analyzed causal HSCRP test, which means high sensitivity C-reactive protein. Let me explain first for our viewers that a high sensitivity CRP test is performed to help predict a healthy person's risk of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and strokes. The level of this protein is also a marker of chronic low-grade inflammation. But what is the reason for using this test in the LDL studies, and what were the conclusions?
The reason for the recent emphasis on inflammation in HSCRP is the flawed 2000 Jupiter study, which, as you recall, involved healthy men and women with normal LDL cholesterol, but elevated HSCRP, high-sensitivity C-reactive protein. Those who took 20 milligrams of Crestor daily reduced their risk of coronary events by 44% more than controls who received a placebo. LDL plunged 50% to an average of 55 milligrams per deciliter, the lowest levels ever reported in a major statin study. But there was no correlation between this drop and the degree of LDL lowering. High sensitivity C-reactive prone, greater than 2 milligrams per liter, and the presence of at least one additional risk factor, such as hypertension, low LDL, smoking, or a family history of coronary heart disease. This firmly established HSCRP as a risk factor for coronary heart disease and implies that inflammation caused atherosclerosis. It also made 13 million more healthy Americans now eligible for statins. Some claim that HSCRP actually caused coronary heart disease, rather than simply having some statistical association like cholesterol, LDL, and other risk markers.
What is the role of LDL, bad, and HDL, good, cholesterol in arteriosclerosis?
LDL and HDL are not types of cholesterol, but lipoproteins that carry cholesterol to cells throughout the body. They were discovered by Dr. John Goffman in 1946 by utilizing a special flotation ultracentrifuge device that could separate lipoproteins by weight. This revealed the existence of diverse low-density lipoproteins, LDL, and high-density lipoproteins, HDL. He later showed that LDL was bad since it was associated with the rapid progression of atherosclerosis, and that HDL was good because it has the opposite effect. As a result, high LDL and low HDL now became risk factors for coronary heart disease because it was presumed they had a causal role, which, like cholesterol was and LDL, was erroneous.
Yes, but I still don't understand why, after it had been discovered that cholesterol is not the cause of heart attacks and atherosclerosis, the attention had been focused on lowering LDL. Why?
As evidence that cholesterol had little to do with atherosclerosis, emphasis shifted to lowering LDL and VLDL, or very low-density lipoproteins, because they are smaller molecules that can penetrate cells more rapidly. Support for this came from Michael Brown and Joseph Goldstein, who received Nobel Prizes for discovering LDL receptors on cells, and stated in 1984, the more LDL there is in the blood, the more rapidly atherosclerosis develops. However, association does not mean causation. Statins were not widely available when Brown and Goldstein made their discovery of LDL receptors, and the vast majority of statin studies since then show that the severity of atherosclerosis or its increase is not related to either LDL levels or their degree of lowering.
Thank you for clarifying this detail, but lowering LDL does not have any effect on preventing heart attacks?
Lowering LDL as much as possible does not prevent heart attacks. Adding ezetimibe, which blocks the absorption of cholesterol, resulted in a greater lowering of LDL cholesterol and triglycerides, and it significantly raised HDL. However, there was no further reduction in coronary events or mortality compared to statin alone, and it was associated with a possible increase in cancer. Trials of torcetrapib, which raises HDL, good cholesterol, had to be stopped because it increased cardiac death rates and hypertension. In addition, some individuals with very high LDL have increased atherosclerosis. One explanation for this paradox is that particle size and density may determine whether lipoproteins are associated with good or bad effects on heart disease. Light and fluffy LDL particles actually appear to be beneficial, whereas people with a genetic defect produce large HDL particles that are harmful. Thus, we now have to contend with bad LDL that is good and good HDL that is bad, at least with respect to coronary disease.
If high cholesterol, high LDL, low HDL, and inflammation, as measured by an elevated hsCRP test don't cause coronary disease, how do you explain the beneficial effects of statins?
So for the Jupiter study, there's no evidence statins are a benefit in preventing heart disease in healthy people. We previously listed the numerous flaws in the Jupiter study, which, like most drug company-sponsored statin trials, hyped the benefits and minimized or ignored adverse side effects by manipulating statistics. Statins may have some value in preventing further coronary events in patients with existing heart disease, but this is not due to lowering cholesterol or LDL, but anti-clotting and other pleiotropic effects. Similarly, statins are allegedly effective in peripheral arterial disease, stroke, atrial fibrillation, congestive failure, colon, breast, and prostate cancer, Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, and osteoporosis. These rewards are also not related to lowering in cholesterol and may merely be due to the fact that most of these patients were receiving statins because of an elevated cholesterol that protected them from these disorders for decades. Several studies show that high cholesterol protects against infections and cancer, and support for this observation comes from the observation that patients who inherit a very high cholesterol due to familial hypercholesterolemia are much less likely to develop infections or malignancies, and usually don't die from heart disease.
But is there any evidence in order to conclude that LDL, measured on a large number of people, is increasing or decreasing the risk factor of coronary heart diseases?
A recent paper that I contributed to reviewed 19 articles in which LDL was measured in more than 68,000 people who were followed for several years. At follow-up, we found that those with the highest HDL levels lived the longest, and one study reported that those with high LDL lived longer than controls on statins. The notion that high cholesterol caused coronary disease was introduced in the 1960s by the Framingham Heart Study. However, in their 1987 30-year follow-up, they reported that for each 1 milligram drop in cholesterol per year, there was an 11% increase in coronary and total mortality. 3 years later, the American Heart Association published a joint summary which cited this same Framingham report as indicating that a 1% reduction in an individual's cholesterol results in an approximate 2% reduction in coronary heart disease. But here you see the first report talked about what actually happened, showing that a drop in cholesterol increased coronary mortality. The second abstract of this simply talks about relative risk reduction.
Yes, and this is another outrageous lie officially published by the American Heart Association and National Institute of Health. But what are the effects of statins that nobody wished to talk about?
There is good evidence that statins may be responsible for the current epidemic of congestive failure. Statins are carcinogenic in laboratory animals in doses similar to those used clinically and have been implicated in the development of breast and prostate cancer, as has low cholesterol. Although drug companies claim that serious side effects are rare in their trials, many independent researchers have reported that over 25% on statins develop significant complications, including muscle and tendon complaints, type 2 diabetes, liver damage, hearing loss, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, Parkinson's disease, depression, amnesia, nerve injuries, kidney failure, as well as cancer. With respect to efficacy, numerous studies have shown that statins are not effective in the elderly or women of any age. Because the raw data in company-sponsored statin trials is not available, it is impossible to verify their results and conclusions. That changed in 2013 when the release of all raw data was mandated. And since then, no statin trial has demonstrated a significant efficacy.
But this is incredible. I just don't know what to say. So many years of lie and deception just for selling statins to a majority of healthy people, not to mention the adverse effects, and in fact not preventing anything at all, but causing a lot of problems. But please, let's go on. You have previously stated that increased stress is a much more important cause of heart disease than elevated cholesterol or LDL. My next question is, could you explain how you reach this conclusion?
Well, stress is an important, if not the major, cause of coronary heart disease for numerous reasons, including: one, stress increases the Framingham standard risk factors: cholesterol, smoking, and hypertension, as well as diabetes, obesity, and hsCRP. For those who still subscribe to the lipid hypothesis, stress has a much greater effect in raising cholesterol than fatty foods, as demonstrated in tax accountants as April 15th approaches, and students on the eve of an important exam. Stressful life change events, depression, anxiety, type A behavior, and hostility have all been linked to an increased incidence of coronary events. Stress causes coronary vasoconstriction, as well as an increase in platelet stickiness and aggregation that promote clot formation. Stress increases levels of homocysteine, fibrinogen, and other coagulation factors that contribute to coronary heart disease. Stress can cause broken heart syndrome, so-called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. This myocardial stunning is due to a left ventricular contractile dysfunction that frequently mimics massive myocardial infarction. Stress can precipitate and worsen congestive failure. Stress causes atrial fibrillation, the most common sustained arrhythmia, as well as ventricular fibrillation, the leading cause of sudden death. And these are due to increased catecholamine secretions like adrenaline. Over half of patients with paroxysmal atrial fibrillation attribute the onset of an attack with antecedent stress.
But this is amazing. Stress is on the basis of all these dangerous diseases? Can you elaborate more on this issue?
Stress-induced catecholamine hormones and sympathetic nervous system stimulation can cause sudden death by triggering ventricular fibrillation, but rebound parasympathetic overdrive may also cause death due to asystole, an abrupt cessation of ventricular contraction. Stress also increases free radical damage and inflammation, both of which have been incriminated as a cause of coronary disease.
Please, let me change the tape. Așadar, cauza principală a bolilor de inimă, precum și a multor altor boli, nu este consumul de grăsimi saturate, nu este colesterolul mărit, ci stresul. Data viitoare veți afla lucruri nebănuite despre efectul stresului și ce puteți face pentru a preveni daunele ireversibile pe care acesta le poate aduce organismului. Fiți alături de noi data viitoare la o nouă întâlnire cu Știință și Cunoaștere.